panelists. My name is Mark Wu. I'm an assistant professor at Harvard Law School. And this panel, I want to first start out by recognizing Gonzalo Navarro and the Internet Association of Latin America for having put this panel together. I'm going to start today with just a quick overview of the various tensions in this field. For those of you who may not follow this quite closely, although looking at this audience, I think almost all of you do. So this next 5 minutes could be you can tell me what I've gotten wrong about the primer that it will provide. And then what we're going to do is we're going to have two quick rounds of questions. I'm going to toss out a question to each one of our panelists, ask them to try to keep their responses within 5 minutes, then go out for a second round, and then hopefully leave much time for the audience to ask questions of our panelists. So I think most of us recognize how the world of production, services, value chains, and trade is being transformed by digitization. And the world of zeros and ones knows no boundaries. These data flow seamlessly through pipes, cables, and so forth, from Iceland to Reston, Virginia, to Hong Kong, to Sydney, and so forth. But there are governments that would like to impose limitations on these cross-border data flows. And our discussion today is going to center around what forms of restrictions might we expect, what impact will this have on the development, particularly of SMEs in a region like Latin America? And where are these regulatory concerns justified? Where are these regulatory concerns perhaps overblown and will have negative implications on international trade? And what can we do about it, both within the trade regime and if the trade regime should not respond, where else can we expect over the course of the next 2 years until we meet again at the next ministerial conference? So I think the regulatory concerns in this space oftentimes have to do with three different areas. One is around privacy of user data and unauthorized usage of such data. A second is about who gets to extract the economic value that is increasingly captured behind this data. And the third is around law enforcement, national security, and being able to access this data readily. And we hear each of these different types of justifications being tossed out for various types of policies, and I will just put them into two buckets just to frame the conversation today. One of those being data localization requirements, which you can think of as a 21st century equivalent of export restrictions. Essentially, you cannot move this data beyond the territory of this jurisdiction. A second, being a bit more flexible, but just simply requiring local storage requirements. That this data a copy of this data must be stored onshore. You can move it off as you want, but both of these require some form of this data being retained onshore. Now, beyond all of this, we're also seeing or hearing other types of data restrictions being imposed for what I would characterize as 21st century industrial policy. So as the world is increasingly shifting towards AI, Internet of Things, there is an increasing recognition of the importance of data, not only for internet services, but also to the tie to global value chains, and a sense that there needs to be some form of industrial policy that centers around control of this data in order to extract not just the value of the data, but in order to embed yourself into these global value chains and industrial policies. And I think many of us sitting here a decade ago would have poo-pooed this idea, would have said, no, of course, open internet flows is essential for being able to build out viable internet companies and strong AI, Internet of Things industries. But I think many governments, or at least I should say some governments in developing countries, have looked at the rise of Chinese internet companies and the buildup of that ecosystem and taken the lesson, well, essential to that is some control over the internet ecosystem and in particular the data. So I think there is that concern, an industrial policy concern. There is concerns about data portability and consumer issues. There are concerns about the cost, especially to SMEs, of having to comply with multiple forms of requirements, and is this serving as an implicit barrier to trade here in the 21st century that's essentially advantaging the large players? And we have seen trade law respond, but as usual, trade law is many steps behind the curve of where industry is going to be. And for those of you who may have heard Jack Ma's comments yesterday, launching the partnership with the WTO and the EWTP, right? He basically said, I'm going to build it. Whether you have regulation or not, this is going to happen. And I would prefer that you stay out of our way. Rather than to worry and build all of this, I would prefer that you let the problems emerge and then respond. So trade law, of course, across the street, they're still debating. Does the mandate of the work program even allow for discussion of data? Not to mention any of these types of issues. Among the 70 or 71 FTAs that address some form of e-commerce digital trade related provisions, only a small handful, we can count them on one hand, right, that have any provisions that even address explicitly these types of data localization, data storage types of requirements. So that's the world that we live in. And I will hope to reward you in the next 90 minutes for having gone up so early with a very frank conversation about these types of issues. So Nick, in that spirit, I'm going to start this out, and I'm going to start by asking you a question that we often hear about in developing countries. Mm-hmm. This issue about simply will free flow and digital trade simply just widen the economic divide and the digital divide between rich and poor countries, right? Essentially, we still have half the planet that is not on the internet. We have most countries, a wide variety, facing some number of infrastructure challenges. So essentially, how do you respond to those who would say, basically, right, this push for free flow is just the 21st century form of economic data colonialism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sort of a two-part question, I guess. You've got the economic divide and the digital divide. And I'll start off by talking about the digital divide questions. I think that's super critical to getting any of this right. We still have a huge, huge problem in the world, and the recent UNCTAD Information Economy report goes into great detail on the divide that still exists, and I think it's something like 2% of people in at least developed countries, yes, that's the report,
Thanks for that.
have purchased something online. The number isn't that much better in developing countries in general. We still have a huge 3.5 or 4 billion people who are not connected to the internet, and that is a prerequisite for digital trade at this point. We can't really even talk about sort of the benefits of data, of cross-border transfers, without first getting that basic part of our world right. And so, at Google, we're taking a lot of steps to invest in closing the digital divide, but we also think there's many steps that governments can take. And so this is actually why I don't think it's really, the sort of digital trade discussion is often framed as a deregulatory agenda to get the government out of the way. But in fact, there are many, many steps governments can take to really promote access into their countries. And I think a lot about sort of getting, there are submarine cables, and Google is a co-investor in 5 new submarine cables that are coming out right now. But the real problem is getting connectivity from the coast, from where the cables are inland. And so that's where I think there's a real need to think about making sure that there are policies in place to really enable sort of fiber build-out, spectrum sharing, steps you need to take to get between the submarine cable and sort of the last mile access ISP provider. And we're taking a lot of steps in Africa and elsewhere to try to figure out how to solve those problems. And of course, why it matters, it's because I think the World Bank found that a 10% increase in broadband access correlates to about 3.2% economic growth in developing countries. And countries with higher internet penetration stand to gain about 25% more benefit from data flows than those without higher internet penetration. So, this is really a prerequisite, the digital stuff, and I think it's a mistake to go too quickly to the sort of the economic data issues without getting that basic infrastructure stuff right. Now, of course, and I think what I'll also point out that, the UN has articulated internet access and the Sustainable Development Goals, I think it's number 9C, as one of the other prerequisites of digital trade. And so I'd love to have a conversation with others here, including, from the sort of telecom world, about how we can really better work together to solve those kinds of problems. One other example of what we're doing is Project Loon. So if you're not familiar with it, Google has a network of balloons that are floating in the stratosphere. And they're carried by winds up to about 20 kilometers up in the air. And the idea is to figure out how can we work with on-the-ground LTE providers to get that access spread around the world more efficiently. They've traveled over 25 million kilometers since launch, and they can last for about 190 days up in the air at a time. Each balloon has a coverage area of about 5,000 square kilometers. This is one way, and there are many other steps needed, but this is one step that we're taking to figure out how to really sort of spread out that access to areas that really don't have it right now, including after natural disasters in Puerto Rico and elsewhere. But of course, yeah, there is an economic divide too, and if we don't think about that in the context of the digital stuff, then we're going to fall short as well. And the really positive stuff that we've been seeing recently has to do with the growth of small businesses and really micro businesses in developing countries that are increasingly using tools, the digital tools, data-driven services to find new export markets. And the way I think of this is that we're trying to figure out what data is there to show what the potential is if you're a small business to trade globally. And we have a lot of interesting data that's coming online soon, I think, from Google that will show that in developing countries in particular, there's massive, massive demand for the products and services that SMEs are trying to sell. For instance, in Costa Rica, if you create an ad on Google, it turns out that 40% of the clicks on that ad come from outside of Costa Rica. In Pakistan, it's like 55% of the clicks on your ads come from outside of Pakistan. In Kenya, if you're a large business, about 35% of the clicks are coming from outside of Kenya. And the numbers are much higher in Zimbabwe and Tanzania and many other countries in sub-Saharan Africa. So the question is, there's this huge demand, I think, globally for the stuff that people in developing countries and LDCs are making. But how do you actually operationalize that demand? How do you build a tool? How do you enable small businesses to really grow? And I talked about this yesterday a bit. We've built a tool called Market Finder that's intended to allow any small business around the world to really figure out how to become an exporter, how to develop an export plan, how to get a sense for where people are searching for your goods and services, then how to connect and how to overcome customs barriers, localization barriers, various kinds of regulatory barriers to get your stuff out there. And so we're very happy to sort of talk with any country and any business in that country about how we can better enable them to really become exporters. And this is a huge area of growth, I think, especially for folks in developing countries and LDCs. So I'll stop there. It's enough talking. And I'd love to hear what other folks have to say about this topic.
Well, thank you, Nick, for getting us started on this. Torbjorn, let me turn to you next. And I should point out, right, for those of you, I'm not going to do introductions, but everyone's affiliation is listed up there. But Torbjorn, you're behind the Information Economy Report, which I think many of us rely upon for the latest information in this space. And what's your sense of what the growing reliance on data means for developing countries? Help us unpack the myths here a little bit. What's really a problem? What's the trade-off? What's something that's just talk?
Thanks, Mark, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. So I think this is a very broad question, of course, and maybe I could start by taking a step back and just looking at how we view this evolving landscape. And we agree that we see that we're really on the cusp of a very new digital economy. We're only in the very, very beginning of something that will be very different to what we're used to. And this is very much enabled by the improved computing, storage, and transmission power of the ICT system. And just to give an illustration, in 1980, to rent or buy 1 gigabyte of storage space cost about $400,000. Today, it costs about 2 cents. So it's a massive change in what you can do with collecting data, analyzing data, and using it for your business activities. And there are some estimates saying that in 2019, the global internet traffic will be about 66 times bigger than in 2005. So it's just a bit more than a decade. Now, in this new digital economy, the role of platforms is growing in importance. We have all kinds of digital platforms. And these digital platforms, they thrive on massive data collection and the ability to analyze these data and transform them into business opportunities of various ways. And they can extract gains in different ways. If we look at, for instance, Google and Facebook, they are able to use their access to data by selling advertising space. And I think that accounts for something like 90% of the total revenue of these companies, roughly. And then you have other companies that are thriving on data analysis, data collection from the sensors of all their things that they are producing and that are being used around the world. And they are using this data and the intelligence coming with it to optimize their production, sales, R&D, value chain management, and so on and so forth. And then there are other platforms that are basically extracting rents from other companies using them, like cloud platforms, like Amazon Web Services. Now, these platforms, they want as much and as diverse sets of data as possible to reap great network effects and to improve their algorithms. So a company like Google that has a huge number of users will have a greater possibility to fine-tune their algorithms to provide better services also to the users of those services. So there's a clear interest in many businesses evolving in the digital economy for having free flows of data, because this is it's like the resource that they are extracting now, and they are transforming that into profit opportunities and business opportunities, and for improving the services that they are providing. Now, this also means that the type of competition that is arising here is changing. Less price-driven and more in terms of the ability to collect, analyze the data and to transform them into business opportunities. And with increased use of cloud computing, social media, e-commerce, Internet of Things, etc., this is just set to grow immensely in the future. Now, of course, digital platforms, they create fantastic opportunities and advantages for the users. Better search engines, better ways of buying and selling goods online, and better product services in whatever area that they're used in. And often these services are provided for free, where the users are paying by providing lots of data on what they're doing, what they're thinking, what they're saying, their networks, where they are, etc. With the wearables, the Nike is getting a lot of information on when people are running, how they are moving, and so on and so forth. And this, of course, creates a number of issues related to some of the ones that Nick already mentioned: privacy, competition policies, consumer protection, national surveillance, cybercrime, fraud, etc. It's a wide range of issues that are coming into play here, far beyond just having access to affordable ICT infrastructure. So what does that mean for developing countries? Well, the starting point is exactly that was mentioned, that they are far behind in the use of the internet and in the use of data for their own business opportunities or for business activities. There is, in general, of course, there are variations here in the very diverse group of developing countries, but there is generally a less developed awareness and understanding of the opportunities and risks involved here, partly as a result of lack of affordable ICT infrastructure, lack of laws and regulations. When we start talking about cross-border data flows, half of the developing world don't have data protection legislation right now, and many don't have consumer protection for online activities. There's also a huge lack of skills in developing countries in such areas as cybersecurity, data scientists, etc., etc. So in general, the countries are less prepared to compete in this new world. They are less prepared at the government level to provide the environment that builds trust for using the data-driven development. And the business sector is typically less capable of making use of it as of today. So I think what we need is much more emphasis on understanding the development implications. We don't have all the answers, but we just know that we are moving in at different levels right now. And I think the developing countries need to learn a lot from the advanced economies right now. It's not just a north-south issue, because the new digital economy is transforming also the developed countries' economies. And there's a need to foster more dialogue here. And I think it's great that we're having this discussion here. Next week in Geneva, there will be an Internet Governance Forum where we will also bring perhaps the Internet perspective to the trade perspectives and have a joint discussion. But there is clear need for more clarity for businesses and for users. We need to have more clarity on what rules apply. And right now, there is no clarity. There are lots of diversity around the world in what data protection rules apply, and they are often not interoperable. And that creates less predictability and less business opportunities, I would say, and less trust. And I think when we did our study about a year ago, we found that throughout these different procedures or rules and approaches for protecting data or controlling data flows, at the principle level, there is quite a lot of common understanding. But it's in the implementation of these principles where you have the biggest differences. And so further discussion is needed, and I think we need to kind of speed up that dialogue because the digital economy is evolving so fast.
Thank you, Torbjorn. Sebastian, let's pick up on the point that Torbjorn mentioned, specifically about what you at the GSM Association, right, touch upon very much here, the physical infrastructure, but also the other elements, the ecosystem that accompany that. And how do you see it, the datafication of the economy changing trade? And in particular, let's touch upon a little bit more about the global value chains. How is this changing global value chains? And in what ways can policy and competition approaches sort of affect this phenomenon?
Well, let me introduce also the GSMA because we are sort of new in this kind of discussions. We are the global association representing the interest of the mobile ecosystem. All mobile operators in the world are part of the GSMA. We tend to say that we are the UN of the mobile industry. And we know about connectivity and also bridging, the digital gaps or the connectivity gaps. First of all, we used to say many years ago that our main goal was to connect everyone to mobile telephony. And after that, today we have more than 7 million connections, more than internet connections, that are connected to have access to basic phone services. And this means that there are like 5 billion users around the world. That was our goal, but then our goal was more how to connect people to mobile internet. So where there was mobile telephony, we wanted to also give internet access. And with internet access, and with all the challenges to drive connectivity, such as coverage, how to reach uncovered areas, how to address the issues of affordability, people that cannot afford those services, what are the elements behind, but also the areas of lack of skills, people not using today, mobile telephony, or not using connecting to a smartphone because they don't know how to use it, they don't know how that can be useful for their lives, or also the lack of content. And this is very relevant for Latin America. I'm the head of Latin America. My area of work is Latin America. And among policymakers and also international organizations around the region, these are our everyday chat. How to really bridge the connectivity gaps, how to make to create more trust on people to connect. First to connect because 56%, we have done a consumer survey in Latin America, and 56% of the people that don't connect today, they say because they don't do it because they don't feel secure to do it. And trust, we all know, it's a key element for e-commerce, a key element for really being able to ensuring and also benefiting of all the positive things that the internet brings. So it's not just connectivity, but also making sure, for instance, on the use of data and how to create a data economy. So, and we are studying the value chains. As you know, mobile operators' businesses is changing. It's not just about rolling out infrastructure. It's also about providing value-added services, and we are studying different value chains. And also, while we get into different other verticals, other sectors like the automotive sector, like smart cities, like sensors or smart metering, those are whole new businesses and whole new areas in which we also see that there will be different, externalities and value chain opportunities, not only for infrastructure providers, but also for local companies. And this is something that we try to strengthen as well and to highlight to local governments, because infrastructure will be critical to be able to enable all this digital platform and this fourth industrial revolution to really exist. I don't know if you are aware, and there are very much discussions about 5G. And 5G, the International Telecoms Union is going to decide what 5G is at the beginning of 2019. And 5G will leverage all different networks. They will do network slicing. We have very low latency that will allow self-driving cars, a lot of artificial intelligence, but also will be created to connect all things. and will be ready for Internet of Things, not only connecting people, but also all the things. And all those things will be, creating data. So how to leverage also this big data and this data economy is not just a matter of Google, it's not just a matter of Facebook, it's a matter of everyone. And I think small and medium enterprises and even countries are all interested on how to really leverage this. Yesterday we had a discussion at the Chancellery of Argentina with also the Internet Association of Latin America and the UN Economic Commission. And our main concern is how to digitalize production, how to make small, medium enterprises of Latin America to really become digital. Some of them are very basic. And so how some basic platforms like e-government platforms, which will be the ones making small and medium enterprises in local and small populations in different parts of across the region. If those companies start by paying taxes online, doing some, and doing some basic transactions, that will drive them also to connect and also to leverage on the benefit and become more productive, and then it will have a whole impact on the GDP and GDP growth and economy. So there are many value chains, there are many opportunities, and I think the digital divide will really, will widen if we don't really embrace this, the opportunity that's also the transfer of data and the free transfer of data means across countries. Obviously, there are, Latin America, there is a different approach in terms of regulation. We always are looking if should we follow, the European regulations or should we follow US kind of approach? This is always the debate in the region. And I think we are all learning on the way. We are all learning. I think we are all. There will be many mistakes. Everything is provisional about this matter, but I think there should be a consensus, and we are really pushing for the message that really restricting and also pushing for data localization stifles innovation, really create a fragmented approach that no one really will be benefiting of. I think a local small and medium enterprise based in Latin America would like to connect to others, would like to really in one day be able to offer their products, and also will really need to understand how global platform works, and also develop their own data economy. So that doesn't mean not having privacy rules. I think we are really very much we in the mobile industry as well, we support really to how to converge both things, how to promote the free flow of data, but at the same time protect and have good privacy protection rules that are all that are follow international adopted principles of proportionality, non-discriminatory. So I think those are the key elements that we are particularly seeing from a global perspective, but also we in a region, in a developing region.
Bob, let me turn to you last. This is an area where the WTO has been actively involved in trying to do economic analysis, but also to improve the quality and the state of the data that's available. And so based on the work that you all have done to date, how do you see cross-border data flows lowering trade costs? And have they facilitated the fragmentation of production and global value chains? And in particular, distinguish a little bit between what we think of as this evolution of cross-border data flows and the link to the cross-border goods flow as these data and goods increasingly become intertwined in these global value chains.
Well, thanks, Mark. It's pretty clear that this new technology has dramatically lowered trade costs, both for B2B and B2C. So all the research that we've seen suggests that platforms such as eBay and Alibaba dramatically increase participation of small and medium-sized enterprises in global trade, because essentially it lowers the cost of finding buyers and accessing foreign markets. There are other elements along that supply chain, such as logistics and customs clearance and things like that. And interestingly, you see a lot of these platforms expressing interest in getting in the other elements that generate trade costs along the supply chain. So the whole spread of global value chains has been significantly augmented by the ability of firms to both manage production, but also to manage the movement of inputs, intermediates, parts, components in their production chain. So it's been rather transformative. It's really facilitated this globalization. It's facilitated multinational companies, I think, their ability to operate almost anywhere, which, by the way, has some interesting, I think, political economy dimensions. So we see that this technology really does help lower trade costs fairly significantly. There's still high trade costs, so don't think that it eliminates them. Our estimates of trade costs are over 200% for developed countries and over 300% for developing countries and much higher for some developing countries. And often it's what happens behind the border of the developing country that drives up trade costs. So closing that digital divide could help significantly, along with some other actions such as infrastructure investment, regulatory reform, might help significantly lower trade costs in developing countries. I do think that there's a significant challenge in understanding how data generates value. So we held a conference, Torbjorn, I think you were there, Nick, you were there, where we brought in some businesses and industry associations to talk about how data generates value. And frankly, I was hoping to get firms coming in and say, we know exactly how it generates value. And I think one of the interesting outcomes of that conference was firms often don't really know how the data that they collect is going to generate value, and they're often experimenting and exploring. And I think that's kind of interesting. We always hear the story about Rolls-Royce or General Electric monitoring their engines and having thrust as the product that's being sold, a service of thrust as opposed to the engine. But a lot of that comes from the ability to both collect and, more importantly, analyze the data. Let's see, your other question, Mark.
And mobile operators certainly are the ones that are not completely using all the data they have as well.
Right.
This is something that we are all discussing at the same
So
time.
this absorptive capacity, and just because the data is there, and I think a number of folks at this conference brought up the point that the Economist in the cover they had, where data is the new oil, is pretty mistaken in trying to equate something that's inexhaustible. Data is pretty much inexhaustible with an exhaustible resource like oil, and that there's a quantum element. Data can exist in many places at once, but what's important is your ability to extract insights from the data. So there's this analytical capacity. And I think we heard from Torbjorn, it's important that developing countries generate some capabilities in this place. But one of the comments that I had was I think a real challenge for us economists is to understand how the gains are distributed in these platform or network economics environments. So everybody gets concerned that Google and Amazon, Alibaba, and I have some interest in trying to understand it. They get very big, but they're also generating a lot of value for the customers, the consumers, and for the producers that are participating in the network. And they get, my sense is thus far, I could be wrong, that they get a small slice of every transaction. So it's volume, and they get a lot of transactions, and therefore they get big. They generate a lot of revenue. But I think the interesting economic question then is to figure out how much are they benefiting the participants, the sellers, and how much are they benefiting consumers. Now to the last question, which was about how might it affect physical trade flows. I think that was your question.
Yes.
It was, this is, my guess is that the physical goods intensity of global trade is going to decline. And we see dramatic increases in cross-border data flows. Pankaj Gamawat is one guy who generates an indicator for cross-border data flows. And he shows that while trade flows and people flows across borders, capital flows have been relatively stagnant in the last 5 or 6 years, although trade's recovering, that data flows have increased dramatically. There's some speculation out there, a study by ING that suggests that deep penetration by 3D printers could have dramatic effects on physical good flows. My guess is we're going to have some scale effects there, that as trade costs continue to fall, that we may not see absolute declines in physical goods trade, but that we'll see physical goods trade intensity in cross-border flows decline, which, you know, that's something that we're going to be running some scenarios on over the next year or so and trying to look at what the main drivers might be and see how that sorts out. But I do think that's a fairly safe bet, and that'll have implications for fragmentation, reshoring, and things like that. I'll stop there.
Anyone else care to sort of chime in on this first part, which is really about scoping what do we know, right? So, Torbjorn?
Can I just quickly continue what Bob took up there? I think the analogy with the new oil, I think it's also incorrect. I agree with that, but it's definitely a resource that can be extracted, because that's what it's all about. By contrast with oil or other metals, if there are huge amounts of supply of this, the value goes down. But that doesn't apply to data. The more data companies have access to, the more value it has.
If they have the capability
to
get
exactly,
the insights.
Exactly. So that also means that there are
differentiator.
implications for who can really grasp the big gains from this. And while I agree that there is no doubt that we need to understand the distribution of the gains, but there's clearly huge gains to be made from this. The top 4 companies in the world by market cap today are, not sure about the order here, so I'm sorry about that, but it's like Apple, Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, and Alibaba is not far behind. So there's no doubt, if you have the skills and you have the network and capabilities, you can reap great benefits from that. Then absolutely, there are huge network effects in this kind of activities. So I think what we're seeing now is also more competition among the different big players in the digital economy, going for different approaches, but trying as much as possible to capture as much of what the consumers are doing, but in different ways, coming in from different perspectives. So finally, understanding also how to reap benefits. I think it varies a lot between the platform companies, like the ones that are serving the world, consumers, like Facebook has 2 billion users now, I think, or something, and Google has many more users using their search engines, etc. But if you go to like the manufacturing firms, like Caterpillar, they are mainly competing with 3 or 4 other players in the world. And I think they are almost for defensive reasons forced to become good at analyzing the data, because that's where the battle will be in the future, vis-a-vis the few players that they're competing with. So how much more they will make from that, that depends on how well they manage that competition, I think.
I would say this point about absorptive capacity is enormously important, and I think it's worth teasing it out a bit to figure out, you know, what we can do from a capacity building perspective, I think. And often I feel like the conversation around data flows focuses too much on sort of the regulatory picture, not enough on actually what can be done to really enable developing countries to benefit from data. And I think improving the absorptive capacity, I think, which means in part, of course, enabling access and providing more internet access in those countries. So if you're stuck in a landlocked country, you still have a way to get access to fiber from the coasts. And also, you know, trying to figure out what can developed countries do to really, you know, improve skills, improve the ability of not just e-commerce providers, but the broader sort of sectors in that economy to really make use of data in a useful kind of way. also, what can be done to actually ensure that content is created locally? 'Cause that's a huge driver of demand, ultimately. And the demand-side barriers to the digital divide I think, are underexplored in general. But I think if you have people creating locally relevant, locally interesting content, and if they have the tools to create that content and share it with the world, that's going to be a huge sort of source of demand. And I think we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, a radical increase in mobile connectivity driven by the availability of local apps, of local content. And the trade side of this is that when people create local content in many of these countries, it's all going like extremely, at least regional and often global. On YouTube, for instance, we found that the sort of rate of cross-border viewership of videos is over half. So I think it's about 60% of views of a given video come from outside of the country of the person who created that content. And so this is a way, I think, to figure out how do we build regulatory frameworks, how do we build access in a way that really enables these local creators in these countries to create content, to create apps, to really empower themselves by becoming entrepreneurs in this new ecosystem. And I don't know if we have a great solution yet. There are plenty of sort of trade facilitation agendas out there, but I'm not sure they're focused quite enough on the digital side right now. It's the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. I think there should be like a Global Alliance for e-trade facilitation. And UNCTAD has done a fair amount of work in this space already, and I really appreciate the work we've done. But I do think this is a conversation that we can't sort of de-link from the broader sort of data flows conversation. It is actually how do you really, really empower people and entrepreneurs and startups and app developers in these countries, and how do you train them on the digital skills they need? We do our part. I think we've trained 1 million people in sub-Saharan Africa in the past couple of years, and have committed to train 10 million more. But I think we need to figure out ways to sort of standardize that kind of process across companies and between governments to really figure out how to increase that absorptive capacity.
So, go ahead, Sebastián.
No, and from our side, I think we can broaden even more the perspective. For us, the broader ICT industry, I think everything is changing. It's not just data. I mean, we particularly work basically advocating all over the world, how important it is to have like a future-proof regulation, and how existing regulation is really putting a significant burden to traditional businesses that would like to also to become more global, to compete globally. And I think everything is changing. I think all the concepts of competition, dynamic competition. In our industry, for instance, we're seeing a big consolidation drive. And I think we all recognize on the importance of networks, because nothing is going to happen without if there are no fiber or like wireless networks. But for them to be sustainable, they need a different business models. For all, again, if we talk about 5G, 5G will need, in 5 times more cell sites that we have today. And, to be able to operate in super high, high frequency bands like 28 gigahertz will really need a significant drive to increase connectivity. And that means a complete change in the whole regulatory approach. So for us, that means, consolidation, the definition of competition, and also, how the use of data and privacy, and how also we are advocating with many governments how to move from an ex-ante and very prescriptive regulatory approach to a more exposed one. And this is very much needed because innovation is happening. If we are very prescriptive, we really will be shooting ourselves on the foot, not allowing for new services and a new product that come with a different business model to really happen. So for us, this is critical to really to get into this 4th industrial revolution, and for also every country to be able to leverage those opportunities.
So I want to spend, before we open up to questions, I want to spend about 20 minutes focused on particularly this regulatory dimension. So I'm going to toss out a series of questions to each of you, but let's treat this more in a rapid fire type of Q&A type of session, right? And so I started the panel out by pointing out, right, each of you has touched upon several elements of the digital divide, not just the physical infrastructure element, but many times the soft skills elements, the content elements, and so forth, both the threat and the opportunities that these large platform players, but as Torbjorn, you alluded to, right, the disaggregated elements of both just the data scientists, the data analysis, even the backbone providers here. But I think there are many developing countries in particular who do not wish to see a more active e-commerce, digital trade work agenda right now because of this divide. And in some ways, they want to preserve the policy flexibility to respond behind the border. And so, Nick, let me just start out the first question with you. Well, oftentimes what we hear from them is there's this belief that this value is going mainly to you guys, right? To the large providers based in advanced economies, even to the large MNCs on the good side with sophisticated global trading operations, sophisticated data analysis, and that even if there are SMEs in developing countries looping onto or taking advantage of these to tap into supply chains, as Bob alluded to, because of lower search costs and so forth, essentially they're confining themselves to the low value added portions of these supply chains. And that these types of data flow regulations are necessary in order to allow for some form of industrial policy, to allow for the growth of their own platforms, to allow for them to touch on to SMEs, as I alluded to, right? To follow the Chinese industrial policy example here for the e-industrial policy for the 21st century. How would you respond to all of that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting conversation, I think. I think there's often this concept of a development ladder out there where you have to take certain steps and preserve regulatory space in your countries to protect your indigenous industry before they can really grow up and compete and become global exporters. And I think that's sort of, I don't know if it's a myth exactly, but it's something that's, I think it's being shown to be empirically false in a few different countries at least. I think using data-driven services and data-driven platforms for your small and micro enterprises to grow, that's now become a key part of development. If you're going to have a sort of competitive industry globally, then you need to make sure that the companies and the entrepreneurs in your country have access to the tools they need to grow. And so I worry sometimes that there's sort of, again, too much of a focus on policy, not enough of a focus on actually what are the sort of prerequisites for MISMEs, for micro and small and medium enterprises in your countries to grow up. And one example I think of that comes from sort of the app development and content creation side again. And this is an area where I think there is some policy work needed to figure out how we can better unlock the benefits of app platforms, for instance, for developing countries. We've taken some positive steps recently to figure out how to unlock new markets where we can provide payments to app developers. But it's still very, very difficult, ultimately, to provide payments to merchants and app developers in a number of countries due to the sort of the complexity and the sort of balkanization of sort of monetary regulations and a variety of other schemes. But basically, we've moved from about 52 countries 5 years ago where you can make money as an app developer in Google Play to about 77 today, and we have plans to expand that again pretty rapidly in the future. But the challenge for us is always, how do you process payments? How do you deliver payments? How do you work with a central bank? How do you develop a common framework between different countries so you can really figure out a way to actually get the payments into the hands of the people who are creating the apps in the first place? I think there's a real policy space there, maybe in Geneva for UNCTAD, WTO, ITC, and a variety of other sort of institutions to work together to figure out, maybe with sort of the banking regulators and sort of the finance ministers as well, to figure out what is the model framework in place that we need to make sure that the consumer protections are in place, that anti-money laundering rules are working, but they're not working in a sort of balkanized kind of way. They're fairly interoperable between different countries. There's not one single one-size-fits-all solution to this issue, but I think getting people in the room together and figuring out exactly what those barriers are and how we can really radically increase the number of countries that can benefit and can receive payments from app platforms and from content platforms as well, like YouTube. YouTube, I think, now has 97 countries where we can process payments to creators. That's still not enough. We want to provide that globally. You can be an app developer in, I think, 152 different countries right now in Google Play. But if we can only get payments to half of those countries, that's a real problem. And so I think that's a space for the WTO to be thinking about work. It's a space for companies to be volunteering and proactively engaged to provide new solutions. And there's a lot of common interest, I think, that we share with app developers and regulators in those countries to figure out ways around those roadblocks.
Sebastián, let me turn to you next to just weigh in from private sector perspective. Do you agree with Nick that there's not a global one-size-fits-all approach here? And if not, what are the costs you see of fragmentation? And let's touch on privacy for an example, right? Specifically here, we've seen APEC with its own privacy framework. We have this binding rules inside the EU. Do you see that as the approach for the future? And if so, bringing it back to Latin America, do you see that type of approach eventually developing here as well? And what type of world will that evolve in if this is the sort of fragmented rulemaking structure that we're moving towards?
Yes, well, we are very concerned about, what are the right privacy approach, and privacy regulations are at the core of every national regulation. But I think if this is not coordinated, really will stifle innovation, will really create unnecessary burdens for anyone like setting up a business, and will be disproportionate. We think that, also the allowing cross-border data flows is very important, but it certainly has to have rules, the same as with privacy. But those rules really need to be aimed at giving consumers the confidence to engage with digital services, and also be aimed at not creating significant costs for service providers, because that will really enable to create this data economy. We think that we very much agree on regional approach. I think they make a lot of sense, particularly if they are coordinated, and they also, if they try to avoid, privacy principles that are also, follow international guidelines. And this, I think, countries really don't need to try to reinvent the wheel. They really need. It's more important for them to get together and discuss what are the common approach, because these benefits are come by the exchanges, come by trade, and come by them all having a conversion in regulation. That's why we think APEC, privacy framework, and also EU privacy framework is very much going along the lines of what we think that could be done. I think also the Madrid resolution of 2009 has very good set of principles that we think that are, could really guide on how to approach privacy on an open and an also converged way. Particularly if the 6 principles for policymakers in terms of approaching privacy, we think that they need to be lawful and fair. Personal data must be lawfully, fairly processed. They need to have a purpose. Processing should be limited to specified purposes. It needs to be proportionate, because processing should be proportionate and not excessive. Sometimes regulators really tend to request more, and implement stringent regulations that in the end are not necessary. Quality, data health should be accurate. And then there are 2 very important, elements as well, that is openness. The processor should be open about its activities, and accountable. The processor should be accountable for its activities. I think those are really things that, principles that are guiding the OECD and the EU and APEC, and I think those are things that we should be at the corner of every interest on approach, how to approach the issue of data and the data transfer across countries. I think, both are things that could be really achievable, allowing for benefiting for the, of all the positive things that this data economy brings, but at the same time protecting consumers.
Torbjorn, can I invite you to weigh in from a regulatory perspective? How do you see this link between data flows and trade flows? And specifically, maybe comment a little bit more broadly about some of the types of elements where you think perhaps there is some legitimacy for ex-ante regulation, as opposed to what Sebastián commented on, which almost basically echoed Jack Ma's comments yesterday, which is
just go for it.
Right, leave us alone. Right, leave us alone.
No,
do
I
this
say that
ex
rules
post.
are important, but
Right?
you mean
Yeah.
they need to be like commonly agreed.
Yes. So,
I think, we're talking about a lot of things right now. We although the focus of the session is on cross-border data flow, but a lot of things have been said about e-commerce, for instance, which is not just about data flows.
yes.
And I think that it's important to keep those distinctions in mind. And just one comment first on this e-commerce in the concept of the WTO, and there's some reluctance of some member states and so on. I think across the world, I think there is a growing understanding among all developing countries that e-commerce is becoming more and more important for their firms to and for their citizens and consumers to engage in the global economy. And they realize that that has implications for their development prospects. But a lot of countries are very hesitant right now to go into the WTO discussions, at least from a rule-making perspective yet, because they are very uncertain what would be the implications. And just to remind ourselves what the situation looks like when it comes to e-commerce use around the world. In Northern Europe, which are the leaders in terms of the share of population that are engaging in e-commerce of goods and services, we're talking 70 to 80% of the population. And if you remove the very oldest part of the population, the very youngest part, that's basically the whole population. You compare that with even relatively big developing countries that are also OECD countries. Take Mexico. We're talking here between 5 and 10% of the population. You go to the least developed countries, we're talking 1 to 2% max that are engaging in e-commerce. That means that 98% of the population are not. Now, in that environment, it's not surprising that the policymakers are not giving the first attention to e-commerce if they don't see that a lot of people who will vote for them, hopefully, will pay attention to that. So from our perspective, it's very important to raise awareness across the board in developing countries about the e-commerce and its implications, about data flows and its implications. And we would very much encourage developing countries to engage as much as possible in dialogue, discussions about these issues, whether it is in the WTO or in UNCTAD or in other fora, because there's a lot to be learned, and we are all learning it as we speak almost. When it comes to the data flow and the restrictions on data flows and data protection, I think just sometimes we end up in these debates about like it's 0 or 1, either total freedom for data flows or very, very, very restricted, where everything needs to be kept in country. And none of these are realities. I don't think there is any country in the world that has no restrictions on data flows. So the question is here, or I think maybe the approach needs to be that we need to understand what are the concerns of the different stakeholders in a country. The governments from national security and law enforcement, the consumers and users like privacy issues, and what have you. But also from the business community, to be able to develop their business, to innovate, to trade, and so on and so forth. And to try to find the common sort of denominators where they are the least trade restrictive, but they do address the concerns. Because if you have full freedom, I think fewer people will also engage in the internet because they will feel less protected somehow by legislation. And that comes into financial regulations. I mean, we have always had regulations, even before we had data flows on the internet, that you have to keep your records for a company in many countries for 10 years so that the law enforcement tax authorities can go back and check, have you done the right things and so on. We see that, and that's another thing that we're trying to push a little bit here in the Information Economy Report, that as more trade goes digital, then it becomes more important for trade policymakers to think about what are the implications for trade, how to regulate these data flows and trade online. At the same time, if you want to start regulating trade online, it becomes increasingly important that you understand how the internet works. So what we're pushing is that we need to find new avenues here to bring the trade policy community with the internet governance, internet policy community. And these are two very different worlds. Although there's the same countries engaged, the format for engaging in the dialogue is very, very different. With the trade policy negotiation, be it at the WTO or in bilateral or regional fora, it's state to state. Whereas all we talk about the internet governance discussion is very much multi-stakeholder, even if it's in the end it's the governments that set the rules. And somehow we need to bridge these two worlds together because trade policymakers generally are not experts in how the internet works and vice versa. So there's a big opportunity for learning. We think that UNCTAD's e-commerce week that we are holding for the 4th time in April this year where we'll also have our second intergovernmental group of experts on e-commerce and digital economy, serve as a great forum for member states, together with the business sector, civil society, and the technical and academic community, to come together to discuss this. And since I have this opportunity, I'm going to do some marketing. This year, the focus is very much on the development implications of digital platforms. So what you just said, Nick, about Google's efforts to make it possible for more app developers to actually get monetization or profits out of what they're doing is very much welcome. And I hope that you will be forcefully bringing that information forward in the meeting. Thank you.
Just to piggyback on what Torbjorn said about sort of bringing expert communities together, there is a real transparency problem within trade agreements in general, and the WTO in general is better than a lot of the more regional or bilateral FTAs that are out there, but even it obviously has a few problems these days. So I think that if you're going to be talking about complex internet regulatory issues, then you want to make sure that the right stakeholders are in the room, and that often means both sort of a wider range of regulators and a wider range of experts, including from civil society and the sort of internet governance world. Internet Governance Forum is taking place next week, yes, unfortunately, in Geneva, right after this conference. I wish the two were sort of meshed together in a more kind of coherent kind of way. But it's great that UNCTAD is taking some other steps to sort of open up that dialogue elsewhere throughout the course of the year.
Bob, I want to invite you to add any last words that you'd like, especially from WTO's perspective.
I think it's important, particularly in the context of the WTO, given, as Sebastián was saying earlier, that there's a lot of learning along the way here. I think many WTO members are very concerned that it's the objective of the WTO is development of rules. Well, that's one aspect of the WTO. Another aspect is transparency, exchange of practice, learning. SPS, TBT committees are a lot about exchange of good or best practices. So creating an environment where there's more discussion and learning and understanding that the proper sequence is to build the capacity to understand what the implications might mean for rules is something that's being underutilized at the WTO. And there's a question some members have brought up just yesterday, as a matter of fact, well, we can discuss this at UNCTAD, we can discuss this elsewhere. And that's absolutely true. But one of the advantages of the WTO is that you can discuss it around what the implications might mean for trade. And in this increasingly globalized world, everything's connected, and the WTO does play somewhat of a central role in that, I hope. One last thing, Mark. I was thinking about this. The distribution of value. So Sebastián's group is absolutely critical for Nick's group, right? I mean, I pulled up my phone here. I think I'm on Movie Star. Maybe one of your members, I don't know. And I went to Google Maps to see where is this place, okay? So there's value chain along the way. Movie Star probably got a big piece of that action. The data cost probably, and I ignore your ads. So, but how is the distribution of economic activity generated? So I was at a conference on GVCs in Shenzhen, and Didi Chichung was there, right? This is the Uber of China.
Didi, yeah.
And they were talking about they have an approach where they partner in foreign countries as opposed to go in by themselves. And they're doing a lot of work on traffic management and using the data that their system generates from their drivers, and their goal is eventually to create smart traffic lights. But they have a partnership in India, and if they generate good ideas or insights from their capabilities to analyze data to improve the traffic in Mumbai, where's the biggest value there? It's probably to the citizens of Mumbai who are driving or stuck in the traffic. So it's very interesting to think about more care. We economists tend to try to not pick winners and losers among producers and consumers and government, right? Our welfare measures, our attempt to treat them all the same. And there's some value to sitting down and thinking about that. But the debate at a place like the WTO is how do we make sure our domestic firm has the ability to get the margins that Google gets? And they're not necessarily thinking about the whole distribution of value throughout the economy and how it might facilitate the small service provider. Yesterday in our session, and I'll try to end on this, somebody was handing out pamphlets trying to make sure that there was no MISME discussion, a micro, small, medium-sized enterprise discussion at the among WTO members because it's an e-commerce backdoor, and that small street vendors in India are opposed to e-commerce discussions at the WTO. Sure, they might be, okay, and I'm sure they found some people street vendors in India, but, you know, there's street vendors in India, and then there's all the consumers in India. And who do you pick between there? I mean, do you have capacity development to help some of those street vendors develop capabilities to go into a new and dynamic sector of the economy? I mean, governments should stop thinking about just protecting the status quo or developing the status quo, and they need to think about the dynamics in the economy. And I don't think there's any easy answers. There's probably a set of good practices, maybe a smaller set of best practices, but having that conversation is important. If they're not having the conversation, then they're probably captured by certain domestic interests.
And even on the narrow question of sort of street vendors and kiosks, there's a fascinating company we've been working with in Kenya called Twiga, which provides like just-in-time delivery to kiosks around the country. And they've delivered 200 million bananas, I think, in the last 4 or 5 years to these kiosks. And it's a hugely data-driven platform. They deliver, you know, the goods in tuk-tuks to the
Yes.
kiosks. But the way they do that is through a very sophisticated supply and management chain. So there's interesting examples happening around the world, and folks often don't recognize the extent to which data and e-commerce are playing a role in those transactions.
And also from our point of view, you know, while I'm international affairs professional, I have to really engage with many global and regional organizations, and even also development banks like the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank. And what we are seeing is that digital is changing so many things so rapidly that also is making many debates get old. You know, many people even pushing, you know, anti-globalization or those anti, you know, international trade, or even, you know, and I think even the net neutrality debates, sometimes many things are getting old in the way that they are being discussed, because this is changing. And I see many organizations globally, you know, struggling to really put together the forums to get this discussion, you know, the proper way. This is also what Nick was saying. You know, we have really all the stakeholders. Even Internet Governance Forum is a pretty recent kind of forum. And the ITU is trying to claim and get, you know, and also get a stake in deciding many of also Internet governance issues. And even within national governments, we see this, that the still traditional sectors are having very much a say, and much more important, even though their role and the role for, you know, the current role, the GDP contribution, or even the future role for the future of the, you know, for those economies and the citizens and the next generations, are really not reflected on these debates. I mean, and we see the same, you know, for the stakeholders and who are voting, and, you know, and what politicians are paying attention to. We are really struggling. There are only a few countries in the world that have the right policy-making framework and policy-making structures. One of the things that we are really discussing with many governments is, you know, there are only a few countries that have like a digital ministry. There are only a few countries that still, you know, have telecoms or even internet tied to science and technology ministries or to transport ministries. The World Bank even has, you know, digital aspects under transport. And it's really unbelievable. You know, I think this is changing a lot. And I see, and I'm also an economist, I used to work on trade, and I see, you know, many old economists that are still, talking about old stuff. and not really understanding what's going on the digital aspect. And I think that's why, Rob, you have like a big role on this, because it's really, this is changing a lot. And I think also there are many few economics departments and many few, universities really understanding what's going on the digital aspect. I try to push also my former colleagues that are always focused on financial markets and traditional markets to really have a look on what's going on in digital. But I think still it needs a lot, very much, for development. I don't know, Mark, what's your research?
No. So
how you see that happening with your colleagues?
I'm just a nice moderator for today. Let me open it up for questions. And for those of you with a question, if you could just raise your hand. Let's see how many questions there are first. And then I think what I'll do then, given the questions, let me collect 3 questions. First, let's do one round, and then let's do a second round. And then can I also ask those of you in the first 2 rows if you could just remove these. There are no reserved people coming, I don't believe, but there are some people standing in back. So if those of you who are standing in back, there are plenty of seats up front. Please feel free to come take those. So why don't we take 3 questions first, and then we'll take another round of 3, okay? If you could please identify yourselves, and then if you could wait for the microphone, please.
That's kind of unfair because I wasn't the first one raising my hand. But anyways, Felipe Sandoval from ICTSD. A question for the panel. What do you think each one of you from your institutions or businesses could do in order to assist international trade negotiators to basically shift from a starting point of the perspective of regulators into a perspective driven by what consumers may dictate? Because it seems that the international rules we have in place today are really starting from the assumptions and the interests of regulators rather than consumers.
Okay, thank you. I think someone has a second mic. If you could.
Hi, my name is Vanessa Santos. I work for the Ministry of Planning in Brazil, but I'm here with the head of the Economist because the question I'm going to make is more for an economist perspective. So you were commenting on the network effects, and I'd like to add something about the whole platform effects that kind of amplifies this whole network effects. And what you were talking about is like all the big companies are trying to become major platforms to make each one of the users stay more and more time on it so it can generate probably more data and make sure that there will be the next players for the new demand that are going to come up, which means they're probably going to be the ones providing the new services because they are the ones knowing the data and know what the consumer wants. And adding to that, what Robert said on how can developing countries benefit from participating in e-commerce and on those platforms, because from their perspective, they are more like users than managers of these platforms. And I'm not saying that this is 0-1 and you need to choose which side you're going to be, but how can you elaborate on what Robert was saying, that how can you build partnerships to make sure that developing countries are also becoming part of the value that's being generated and not just becoming users? And the main point is that the whole value is going to the platform, the most part of the value. Of course, you can always participate and put all your communities in the platforms that are going to sell more. But I mean, what's the point of, for instance, my company selling on Amazon if the whole world is doing it? And what is really the difference in 20 years it's going to make if my country is competing with the whole world and nobody sees my product? So something like that.
Okay, and the third question, someone wants to raise their hand and just pass along the mic maybe to the gentleman here.
Thank you. I'm Thomas Strines. I'm a fellow at NYU Law School in New York. And this is a nice follow-up to the question that was just raised. And it's really about the distributional impacts of the digitalization of the economy. Because the story that you guys told was really a data is good for all and digital trade is good for all kind of story. And Rob alluded a bit to the question of distribution of value along the value chain. But there's a larger question about the distribution of value across the globe and between citizens, not just in developing or developed countries, but also within these countries. In the US now, we had a huge debate about that in the context of traditional trade, and the election of Trump was largely associated with that. So the question really is whether this time around we need a different approach to the distributional impacts and whether we need more transnational mechanisms to address this question.
Okay, so 3 questions, if you could each take 1 or at most 2. First question about how do you shift the perspective of the negotiator from regulatory to more consumer-oriented? Second question on network effects and why this is not necessarily just simply entrenching oligopoly, allowing them to capture rents. Third question about the distributional impact and what evidence do we have that light touch would actually help to remedy growing inequality as opposed to exacerbate it?
I'm happy to start and take a very quick cut at all 3 if possible. So in response to Felipe's question, what to do to assist trade negotiators to understand the consumer perspective, that's an excellent question. I think trying to think about ways to actually put negotiators in the shoes of consumers and small businesses to understand what kind of barriers there are, what kind of opportunities there are, where there's a need for greater regulation in this space is hugely important. And one way that we could do that is by providing tools like Market Finder, which is our sort of small business export plan platform. It's available at g.co/Market Finder if anybody wants to check it out now. It's a really cool tool, I think, and it's designed to really show what it takes to build an export plan for a small business. On the question of platform effects and network effects, I'm not an economist, so I won't try to sort of wade too far in that debate, but I will say that data portability is very important, just trying to figure out ways to allow users to take their data and move it to a different platform if they're not comfortable with the privacy practices or the other practices of a platform. Google is taking a lot of steps. There's a program called Google Takeout, so takeout.google.com. If you're not happy with search or Play or YouTube or other products, we make it very simple for you to take that data out and put it into a different service. And that's, I think, the best kind of best practice you can have in that space. And sort of the distributional impacts of trade, yeah, I think we sort of heard loud and clear, not just in the US election, but elsewhere, that people feel shut out of trade in general. It feels like a large force out of their control. They feel like they're not benefiting, even if consumer prices are going down a bit. They're not really seeing how they're being empowered by trade. So I think that's a very important question for us to be thinking about, is how do you well, part of it is around transparency, I think, and making sure that people feel like they have a say, with a voice within trade processes, not just they're being handed some agreement after 7 years of negotiation they haven't seen it all. And I think also, yeah, just thinking about the distributional impacts, in the US, it's a trade adjustment assistance model that hasn't been updated for quite a while now. So trying to figure out how to tie that to broader kinds of unemployment insurance or other steps that can really have a broad-based effect is very important.
Right. Okay, thanks for the questions. I'll mainly focus on the second 2. Very quickly on the question of build partnerships, or how can developing countries benefit from this. I think we don't have all the answers here, but there is definitely a debate going on now among our member states, China is one, about the role of local versus global platforms as well. And I don't think it's always possible to really put them against each other, but there is a growing interest among developing country policy makers to see how can we strengthen the growth of local digital platforms for the needs of our country, where perhaps the big global players have not really shown an interest yet. And we have seen, for instance, Lazada growing up in Southeast Asia, starting to develop e-commerce platforms for 5 Southeast Asian countries. Once it got pretty successful, Alibaba took it over. Souk was another e-commerce platform in Middle East, based out of UAE. And recently Amazon took it over. So this is important, to pay attention to exactly what the implications, ramifications are. It's hard to say, but it's a phenomenon that we're witnessing, and we need to see how this will play out. On the distribution of value, definitely there is a huge issue about the distribution of value here, both between countries and within countries. And making a long story short, we would say that the countries, the people, the businesses that are the best prepared for what is coming now with the digitalization of more and more economic activities are the best equipped to benefit from this. And there is a huge risk that others will fall behind. And so that's why UNCTAD has developed a particular project to help the least developed countries at least to get a fair understanding of where they stand in 7 policy areas. So we do these rapid e-trade readiness assessments because typically they don't have statistics. They're often unclear on who's in charge of digitalization, as was mentioned, among the different ministries. And they often don't have a clear idea of who is engaging in e-commerce, both from the business side and the consumer side. But there are other things also related to distribution of value or revenues, and one issue is related to taxation. This is a big issue also among governments. They are wondering, how do we best tax these global internet and other internet companies? And there are some indications that digital economies that mainly control intellectual property rights have also greater ability to take advantage of tax saving opportunities from international distribution of their profits. So that's definitely a hot issue as well.
Okay, given the time, I think what I'd like to do is capture the other 3 questions as well, put them on the table, and then I'll start the other way. We'll invite Sebastián and Bob to address those questions as well as any of these last 3 questions that were just raised. So those of you with questions, if you could please raise your hands, and then if the mic runners could hand the mics to each of. Okay, so why don't you start, and then if
Great.
the others with
My name is
questions, please
Konstantin
keep your hand
Mattis.
up.
I'm with Alpha Beta, which is a strategy and economics consultancy in Singapore. And I love what's being discussed here today, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. I really would love to hear a bit more about this distribution of value, going all the way back to the users or where the data is generated. And I know some of you may not be big fans of the Economist article that kind of alluded to that a bit as well, but sort of this model of how could users at the end be compensated for the data that they're providing, and would love you to just give your thoughts on a kind of model that sort of sees also the big data-driven companies kind of from the utility standpoint, like a utility operator, where the data is generated at the user standpoint, and they could sort of be compensated in some way or another for supplying that data.
Okay, if you could pass it to back and then also to the front.
Thank you. My name is Michael. I'm with the South African Business Delegation. I'm quite intrigued. Mark, thank you. Your 3 elements in introduction were very helpful and very useful. I'm quite intrigued, though, that we're discussing data. In my country, we say data. It's a bit of a tomato. And yet we're doing it anecdotally. Everything that I'm listening to is a fascinating conversation, but it's an anecdotal conversation rather than a discussion around where is this data, where is it going, what is it actually meant to be doing. I represent a large bunch of clothing retailers, and our intelligence tells us that our biggest competitors are going to not be coming from furniture or food or anywhere else, or even other clothing retailers. Our biggest competitors in the market will be coming from medical services, insurance, and pensions. And if anything is going to be easy to trade in respect of cross-border flows, that's just going to see cash going all over the place. And we're seeing that even in developing countries, and we're particularly interested in markets in Africa. I commented yesterday, we still don't trust the commitment of the developed countries to the aspirations and interests of developing countries, and that remains a concern for us. Yes, we're at the table, we're going to have the conversations, but I'm not comfortable yet that we're talking about hard number issues while we're talking about data. We're still talking about how much fun it's going to be, how some small consumers are going to benefit in terms of access, and how some small MSMEs may be able to benefit. I still don't see the hard conversations happening. So I get the feeling we need to get out of the fun part of this conversation and start getting into the hard numbers sometime. Thank you.
All right, one last question. If you could pass the mic up 2 rows.
Too many.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you also to the panelists for the fantastic discussion. I'm from Istanbul Big University and I'm the W2 chairholder. I think there are two aspects to my question. One is about a recent problem that we had, recent since 2003 in my country, because the Turkish government wanted these, high-tech companies and digital companies to open a branch in Turkey. Because the government said, we don't have an address in our country. This is probably under the GATS. It's a market access problem. So again, a localization requirement that like companies like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Google has to open an office in Turkey and has to pay taxes. Along with what the gentleman from UNCTAD said. So probably my question will go to all of you, but perhaps to the Public Policy Council from Google. How does this affect this requirement and I guess Turkey is not the only country to ask that kind of requirements. And I know that some EU countries followed West in the same manner. And the second question in relation to all of the antitrust cases, which are coming against those high-tech countries, especially by the European Commission. I know this is not totally trade, but I think there is the linkage between trade and competition, which may affect your innovation skills. But obviously, there are other elements which need to be taken into account. So I'd be glad if you can comment on those.
Right, so let me just quickly summarize, right? One question is about the distributional elements. Specifically, what do we know in terms of hard numbers as opposed to anecdotes, and addressing that those gaps there in order to convince developing countries like South Africa. A second stream of questions all around regulations beyond trade, issues of investment, tax, competition, and even possibly regulating it as a utility in order to address some of the concerns here. Sebastián, given time, let me just start with you, see if you'd like to pick up on any of those, and then we'll close with Bob, and then for those of you, we can continue the conversation outside.
Well, those are very tough questions, I think, and there is no single answer about this. Obviously, in Latin America, there are the same debates about, the value chain shifting from the region towards, other, more developed countries. But I think we need to have a cautious approach. This is very much in progress, and we need to have always a very broad perspective on what are the benefits, and also be cautious about the negative effects and how to really create rules that are convergent and are also commonly agreed among countries. I think the issue of network effects and the issues also of the benefits of data flowing across countries, and then one company from, and one startup could be able to sell on some, other countries, even within the same region, it's something important. That's why, dialogue is a key element here. But I think the most important element, and we need to strengthen this, is to protect consumers, to protect their privacy. And I think this is something that we all agree about. And, consumer rights are key. In terms of taxation, yes, there is a need of a global discussion about, tax. Many think probably that the WTO is one organization that can really take that thing, but it's really difficult. I think it's something that it requires a broad agreement globally, and it's something that it will really take time. But obviously, it needs to be on the table. In terms of increasing the gaps and inequalities, I think every country, and particularly the developing one, have more to lose if they don't engage with the global digital economy than if they just set themselves apart, if they impose heavy restrictions to control data, to impose localization, because that fragmented approach will really make companies will not to invest on them. Every government, every president is traveling abroad looking for investment, having to have the right quality in terms of services, and also promote their local companies. So I don't think that that's a good approach. I know that in a post-Snowden era, many countries, even Brazil, there were concerns, and they would try to really find ways to impose heavy localization rules. But in the end, many found out that they were not practical, not really easy to implement. And sometimes this is something that we all need to learn, and also try to match rights also, and aims with reality. Another thing that happens, when you talk with different governments, and every government has a national agenda, a national broadband plan, they all want to create their own Silicon Valley. No, that's my plan is to have this region to become the new digital, Silicon Valley, or they all want to have their own Google, and they really need to be realistic about what they can do, and also find, and also find the ways on how to leverage this new economy and be what they can do. I think these are big mistakes, and I think on trying to really, aim things that probably they are not up to, what they can do. I need to summarize, I need
Sebastián, can I cut you off there in terms of summarizing? Because I think there was a question directed specifically to you, Nick, on Turkey and so forth, and we have seen companies, right, exit Turkey as a result of all this, but it was a broader-based question about investment tax and implications on industrial policy. So just to pick up on what Sebastián said very quickly, and I'll turn it to you, Bob, for last.
Yeah, on the Turkey and data localization question, this is a sort of increasing trend around the world, and I would just say, we respect the law in countries where we operate, and requiring us to build a local presence isn't going to change that. We're still going to respect the law of countries where we operate, whether it's on tax or competition or content regulation, et cetera, and we want to be responsive to governments, whether or not we have an office in that country. And so I think the idea that you need to require localization to require compliance with those laws isn't the right way to be thinking about it. You should be thinking maybe at a broader global level, how do you coordinate approaches on those laws so they can be implemented effectively without sort of doing the sort of piecemeal efforts around localization. So that's my quick response there.
And Bob, on the question specifically on data, hard data, you guys are trying to work very much on pushing to address some of these issues at the WTO as well as at UNCTAD. Any last thoughts from you or Torbjorn on the issue, which I think is at the front of many of the developing countries here? Right?
Actually, Mark, I don't want to address that question. I've got just a second. If we're going to talk about distribution of gains, we're talking about things like economic development. Trade is a wonderful thing, but it's the oil in the economic engine. It's not the gasoline, right? It's not the pistons. That's domestic policy. And the WTO does provide some high-level constraints on your policy choices, but there's tons of choices, and many countries find ways to successfully develop economically. So trade's a great thing. It can be one of these things that contributes, but focus on your domestic policies and make sure there's coherence between domestic and international. And it's not just a developing country issue, it's a developed country issue. That's exactly what happened in the U.S., right? Incoherence.
So maybe on that note, let's extend a hand of thanks to all of our panelists. So thank you all very much. And again, thank you to the Internet Association of Latin America.